She thought he was just an ordinary tramp until her youngest child ran up to hug the man and looked up Mommy. He smells like home. In the quiet town of Maple Hollow, tucked between forgotten hills and winding roads, there stood a weathered shelter that smelled faintly of coffee dust and second chances. It was run by Grace Miller, a woman whose tired eyes still carried fire, once a promising lawyer, now a full-time mother to 4 children and part-time warrior against the silence of being left behind. Her children bore no father's name, only the weight of questions they were too brave to ask. Life moved in rhythms there, laundry, homework, prayers before meals, until one day a man arrived. He didn't say much. Called himself Mr. Dan. Carried a duffel bag and an apology too heavy to speak aloud. Grace should have turned him away, but something in his silence felt familiar, like a song half-remembered from a life she'd almost forgotten. The children took to him slowly, cautiously, except for Sophie the youngest, who said he smelled like rain. And so began the unraveling not of a lie, but of a truth too painful to be named until it begged to be lived. The morning fog still clung to the edges of Maple Hollow as Grace Miller unlocked the rusted gate of Haven House, the modest shelter she had built from the bones of an old post office and years of scraped-together hope. The faded sign above the door read, "Everyone belongs somewhere," and though the paint chipped more with every season, she never repainted it. There was something honest about its imperfection. Grace moved like someone used to exhaustion yet refusing to yield to it. At 39, her life revolved around 5 things: stretching groceries for the week, keeping the shelter's water heater working, tutoring her son Caleb in math, brushing Sophie's hair when she fell asleep too early, and finding a way somehow to keep the lights on 1 more month. No child support came, not even a name on a birth certificate. Her past had been rewritten in silence, but her present was loud with purpose. The shelter held 6 beds, 3 folding chairs, and more stories than anyone dared count. Each night she tucked in strangers beside her own children, Olivia, Caleb, Noah, and Sophie. And each morning she brewed weak coffee strong enough to keep despair at bay. The townspeople respected her from a distance. They whispered that she had once worn suits, carried court briefs, stood beside judges. Now she wore second-hand sweaters and carried lunches in plastic bags. They didn't ask what happened. She never told, because telling meant opening wounds that hadn't fully closed. But on that cold Tuesday morning, as Grace swept the front porch, a man stepped into the fog. He didn't speak, just stood still as if trying to remember how to exist. And something in the way he looked at the house made her heart stop for just a second, like it remembered a rhythm it hadn't dared feel in years. He said his name was Mr. Dan, just that no last name, no story. And when Grace asked what brought him to Maple Hollow, he looked past her shoulder and replied, "Just passing through." His voice was quiet, frayed at the edges like an old shirt worn thin by weather and regret. He didn't carry much: a small duffel bag, a paperback book missing its cover, and a folded photograph he never showed anyone. Grace didn't trust easily, not anymore, but something in his posture didn't feel like a threat. It felt like someone who had once built a life and lost it brick by brick. "We're full," she told him at first, not unkindly, just truthful. "I don't need a bed," he said. "I'll sleep outside, help out during the day. I fix things. Keep quiet." And he did. Over the next few days, Mr. Dan became a shadow that filled the cracks in Haven House, the leaky faucet that stopped dripping, the screen door that finally closed without slamming the broken shelf that stood tall again. He didn't speak to the guests much, didn't ask questions, didn't answer any either. The kids watched him from a distance at first. Olivia, with suspicion. Caleb, with calculation. Noah, with wary silence. Only Sophie, the youngest, smiled at him from the porch one afternoon and offered him half her apple. He took it with a nod, then returned to sweeping leaves without a word. Grace kept waiting for something to shift, for him to ask for more, to act like a man with nowhere to go, and nothing left. But he never did. He simply stayed quietly, as if presence itself was a kind of apology, as if he knew exactly how far he had fallen, and that showing up consistently humbly was the only way back. By the end of the first week, Mr. Dan had quietly folded himself into the rhythm of Haven House, like he'd always been there, like he belonged to the creaking wood floors and the scent of instant coffee and the low hum of evening silence. He rose before sunrise, swept the front walk before the children were awake, and never took more than one serving of food at dinner. He never entered Grace's kitchen without asking, and never looked too long at the family photos on the wall, especially not the one where all 4 children smiled in a field of sunflowers, Grace's hand on Sophie's shoulder, a quiet pride behind her eyes. There was something restrained in the way he moved, something that hinted at old wounds not yet named. Grace noticed, but said nothing. In a place like Haven House, the rule was simple: let the silence speak when it needs to. Still, a part of her couldn't help but watch him more closely than the others. He wasn't like the usual drifters. He didn't fidget, didn't tremble, didn't avoid eye contact. His stillness was deliberate, like someone rehearsing the art of being invisible. Yet each time he fixed something, each time Sophie's laughter followed his quiet handiwork, each time he placed a folded blanket on the donation shelf without needing thanks, he seemed to come alive a little more. A start. A beginning. Not redemption, because that would require the truth, but something softer, the space before a confession, the breath before a name. And as Grace stood in the doorway that evening, watching the last light of day settle over the shelter's tired roof, she realized something had changed. Not in him, in her. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was holding the world together alone. And though she didn't know it yet, this beginning was only the echo of a past that hadn't finished speaking. It happened on a Thursday just after the rain. The children were sprawled across the living room floor, coloring and bickering gently over crayons dulled from too much use. Grace was in the kitchen washing dishes, listening to the hum of normalcy that had become so rare it almost startled her with its softness. Mr. Dan was tightening the hinge on the front closet door, his sleeves rolled up, silent as ever. Then Sophie, with her usual fearless curiosity, wandered over to him with a drawing clutched in her hand and said, "Look, I made a butterfly for you." He glanced at it with a small nod and replied, "That's beautiful, Sophie." Grace froze mid-rinse, the dish slipping slightly in her hand. She hadn't introduced the children by name. No one had. They'd only ever referred to them in passing, the kids, the little ones, the older two. It was an unspoken rule to protect identities at the shelter, to guard what little privacy they had left. A moment passed. Olivia looked up sharply from her sketch pad. "How do you know her name?" she asked, her tone half curious, half accusatory. Mr. Dan didn't flinch. He simply looked down and said, "She looks like a Sophie. Too smooth. Too exact." Grace forced a smile, swallowing the sudden tightness in her chest. But later that evening, she watched him again from the hallway. Watched him call Noah to the dinner table before Noah even entered the room, heard him tell Caleb to remember his spelling test before Grace had reminded him, and saw the way he looked at Olivia like he knew she was still angry at a world that hadn't kept its promises. It wasn't just intuition, it was memory. And in that quiet realization, Grace felt something deep and old crack open, because no stranger could have known their names unless once upon a time he hadn't been a stranger at all. She had been 25, dressed in navy heels and a tailored blazer that didn't quite hide her trembling hands when she walked into the Whitmore estate to tell them the truth. Her name was still Grace Palmer back then, attorney, top of her class, driven by principle and a heart too full of hope for her own good. She was 3 months pregnant. The father was Ethan Walker, and though he hadn't returned her last call, she believed he would do the right thing if given the chance. She never got to see him. Instead, she was met by his mother, Elaine Walker, statuesque and cold as the marble in their foyer, who listened in perfect silence, then said, "Whatever you think this is, it ends today." Grace tried to stand her ground, her voice steady with conviction, her belly barely showing beneath her coat. But Elaine had years of practice in erasing problems. "You're ambitious," she said coolly. "I respect that. But this," she motioned vaguely to Grace's stomach, to her presence, to everything she represented. "This will ruin your future. and his. They offered money, of course, enough to disappear comfortably. But Grace had never been for sale. When she refused, they didn't threaten, they simply erased her. Ethan was sent abroad. Her letters came back unopened. Her phone number was changed in his contacts. And just like that, the door closed. In the weeks that followed, Grace left her firm, her apartment, and the life she had built brick by brick. Not because she was ashamed, but because she knew no courtroom would ever respect the woman who brought 4 fatherless children into the world without apology. She moved to Maple Hollow. Alone gave birth in a rural clinic where the nurse held her hand and whispered, "You're stronger than anyone I've ever met." She didn't cry until the second twin came out not breathing. She named him Caleb after her grandfather and prayed over his chest until he gasped. No one from the Walker family ever called. But Grace kept the name Ethan Walker locked deep inside her, buried beneath the shelter. She built the children she raised and the woman she became. Not a lawyer, not a daughter, but a mother who had chosen truth over reputation and love over legacy. Every morning before the sun cracked open over the Tennessee hills, Grace pulled on her boots, tied her hair into a tight knot, and stepped into the quiet chaos that had become her everyday rhythm. Haven House needed repairs. The roof leaked near the pantry. The hot water was unreliable, and the van used to pick up donations, rattled like an old tin can on its last ride. But there was no time to fix everything at once. The grant money was late. The town council had once again tabled her request for expansion, and whispers still clung to her name like stubborn smoke. 4 kids, no husband. Must be nice to live off pity. You know, she used to be a lawyer. What kind of woman gives all that up? Grace had heard it all, and though she carried herself with a quiet dignity that silenced most judgment to their own shame, the words still pressed into her skin on nights when the loneliness crawled in. Between checking homework, cleaning up after meals, managing intake logs, rationing food supplies, and hugging strangers through withdrawal or grief, Grace often forgot the sound of her own breath. Sophie had an ear infection again, but the clinic bill hadn't cleared. Caleb needed a new pair of shoes after his soles split open, and Olivia was starting to ask why none of the other kids at school had to hide their last names. Grace never had an answer that satisfied. She only knew how to keep going, one foot in front of the other always. What little money she earned from late-night bookkeeping jobs went into the shelter's emergency fund. What little sleep she got came between nightmares of being asked once again, and the father, as if the worth of her children hinged on a man who had vanished before the ink dried on their lives. Still, each night she locked the shelter door, whispered blessings over every bunk, and kissed her kids goodnight with the unwavering resolve of a woman who had long ago decided that being judged for surviving was better than being praised for silence. Grace Holloway had not chosen this life, but she was choosing every day to stay and fight for it. Tucked behind a loose floorboard beneath her bed, Olivia kept a small velvet pouch no one else knew about. Inside was a delicate silver necklace, faded and tarnished at the edges, but still whole, with a tiny oval pendant engraved simply with the letters E.W. She had found it years ago in an old box of donations one her mother had meant to sort through but never got to. Grace had said nothing when she caught Olivia holding it once, her young fingers tracing the initials like they were Braille. She had only stared for a second too long before saying softly, "That's not ours, honey," and gently taking it from her. But Olivia had waited until her mother went to bed that night, tiptoed back into the sorting room, and found it again. Something about the way her mother had looked at it, not surprised, not confused, but as if her lungs had temporarily stopped working, told Olivia that it was theirs. She didn't know exactly what the initials meant then, but she clutched that necklace through school tests, scraped knees, and nightmares. Over time, she wove a story in her mind. E.W. was her father. E.W. wasn't dead, just lost. He had sent this necklace once, maybe from far away, maybe before her mom decided to never speak his name. On especially hard days when the town kids whispered behind her back, or when she overheard church ladies using the word bastard like a prayer gone sour, Olivia would hold that necklace tightly, the cool metal grounding her like truth. She never asked her mother about it again, never showed it to her siblings, but on her 12th birthday, when the others had gone to sleep, she took it out and wore it over her nightgown, staring into the mirror with her chin lifted high, as if the pendant alone made her someone with a name, a story, and a father who had once, if only once, cared enough to leave behind something that bore his mark. She didn't know that downstairs Grace sat alone at the kitchen table, that same necklace, once tucked beneath her collarbone hands, folded in silent ache, whispering apologies to a man she once loved, and the daughter who now wore his absence like an heirloom. At first he was just Mr. Dan, the quiet man, with kind eyes and rough hands, who swept the shelter steps without being asked and fixed the screen door when it squeaked. But slowly, like the Tennessee fog rising off the hills at dawn, he began to settle into the rhythm of Grace's world, not with grand gestures, but in the in-between moments that no one else noticed. With Caleb, it started with a busted bike chain. The boy had been kicking at the tire in frustration when Mr. Dan crouched down beside him, offered no lecture, just tools. Together they worked in silence, grease on their fingers until the gears clicked into place, and Caleb smiled for the first time in weeks. With Noah, who rarely spoke above a whisper, Mr. Dan brought out an old beat-up guitar from his duffel bag one evening and started playing on the back porch soft, finger-picked melodies that melted into the warm air. Noah had sat nearby pretending not to listen until one day he reached out and strummed a chord. Mr. Dan didn't flinch or praise, he simply played the next chord and waited. It became their quiet ritual. And with Sophie, the youngest and most sensitive of the four, it was the garden. Every morning Mr. Dan would water the tomatoes, talking to them like they were old friends, and Sophie, curious, began to follow. She asked questions about roots and sunlight, and he answered without condescension, letting her take the lead. Soon she insisted on planting marigolds to keep the sadness away, and he helped her space them just right. He didn't try to be their father, didn't force affection, but it was the way he noticed them, the way he remembered Sophie hated loud noises, how Noah liked his eggs with pepper, how Caleb flinched at sudden movements, but never said why. Grace watched from a distance, unsure whether to be grateful or afraid. He was weaving himself into their lives one small thread at a time, and none of them, not even her, seemed to realize how deeply he already belonged. Each night, long after the shelter lights had dimmed and the children had gone to sleep, Mr. Dan sat alone on the creaky back porch with a mug of lukewarm coffee, staring into the dark Tennessee woods and listening to the quiet rhythm of a life he never believed he deserved. His name wasn't really Dan. It was Ethan Walker, a name he had buried the day he walked away from Grace and the children, believing he was too broken, too consumed by ambition and cowardice to ever be anything but a mistake in their story. Now, watching them laugh, argue, and grow just feet away from where he lay each night on a cot in the storage room, the weight of what he'd left behind pressed heavy on his chest. He knew their habits, their fears, their voices in the hallway. He knew Olivia hummed when she was anxious. Caleb clenched his jaw when he was trying not to cry, and Sophie always looked to her mother's eyes before deciding how to feel. But they didn't know him, not truly, not as the man who had once loved their mother enough to carve a future with her, then abandoned her when that future demanded courage he didn't have. He couldn't bear to speak the words, "I'm your father," not when it felt like a theft, a title he hadn't earned, a name he had forfeited. So he showed up instead, every day. He fixed what was broken, not just doors or bikes, but the spaces in between, those tiny moments where children sense safety, where trust is earned grain by grain. He would father them not by blood, but by presence, not through rites, but through constancy. And maybe in the quiet offering of his hands and time, in the simple truth of staying when it mattered most, he could begin to rebuild what he had once so thoughtlessly shattered. Olivia had always been the sharpest of the four, the one who watched more than she spoke, who memorized patterns and sensed tension like a weather vane, catching the smallest shift in wind. So when Mr. Dan first appeared quiet and helpful, her suspicion didn't ignite right away, but it grew slowly like a splinter under the skin, just enough to irritate then throb. She noticed how he always seemed to be one step ahead, how he knew where the spare key was kept, even though no one told him how he hummed the same lullaby their mother used to sing when Sophie had nightmares. He never asked what they liked. He already knew. He knew Noah liked his sandwiches cut diagonally, that Caleb hated being touched from behind, that she, Olivia, needed to be asked before anyone rearranged her space. That was the moment it struck her. No stranger learns these things without time. No stranger watches your family like they already belong. She started testing him. "How'd you know Caleb likes lemon tea?" she asked one morning, her tone casual but her eyes hard. Mr. Dan just smiled and said, "Lucky guess." But it wasn't luck, Olivia knew it. Then there was the night she caught him sitting in the hallway outside Sophie's room, guitar in his lap, playing the exact tune from her childhood music box, long broken. She didn't confront him, not yet. But her instincts screamed. People leave, she'd learned. Men leave, and the ones who return pretending to care are the most dangerous of all. So she kept watch. She tracked his words, his movements, the way he looked at their mother when Grace wasn't paying attention. She didn't know who he really was yet, but she was certain of one thing. He wasn't just some drifter named Mr. Dan. And until she figured out the truth, she wouldn't let him near her family without a fight. Charlotte Whitman had built her empire on precision control and an iron will that rarely cracked. As the eldest of the Whitman siblings and now CEO of Whitman Holdings, a sprawling financial and real estate empire, she commanded boardrooms the way generals commanded armies. To the world, she was elegance wrapped in sharp intellect. To those who truly knew her, she was the one who cleaned up Ethan's messes and made sure the family name stayed untarnished. So when a junior analyst from their security division flagged something odd, a facial recognition match of Ethan Whitman in a rural Tennessee shelter under the name Mr. Dan, Charlotte didn't panic. She scheduled a private meeting, poured herself a glass of scotch, and pulled up the footage. There he was, older, worn down, unshaven, helping stack food boxes in a crumbling building that barely passed code. What the hell was he doing there? Last she heard, Ethan had disappeared over a decade ago, abandoning the family, his trust fund, and most scandalously, the young woman he'd gotten pregnant. That woman had been a law student of all things, and Charlotte had made sure any legal entanglements vanished before they could reach the headlines. Seeing Ethan now living among the forgotten, working beside the poor like some penitent monk, filled her with a mix of disgust and dread. It wasn't just about family shame. It was about power. If Ethan had resurfaced, if he planned to reconnect with that woman and her illegitimate children, it could threaten everything. The board's trust, the family's reputation, and worst of all, the airtight version of the past Charlotte had spent years curating. She closed the footage, picked up her phone, and made one call to a private investigator in Nashville. Find out everything, she said coldly. Who he's living with, who he's talking to, and if he breathes a word about Grace Miller, or those kids, I want it buried permanently. To Charlotte Whitman, legacy wasn't just a word, it was a fortress built brick by brick from silent strategy and sacrifice. The moment she confirmed that Ethan had been living under an alias in a rundown shelter, working side by side with Grace Miller and their 4 children, her instincts shifted from curiosity to calculated aggression. The children, those illegitimate, unsanctioned heirs to the Whitman bloodline, were a threat. Not because they had done anything wrong, but because of who their mother was, a former law student who once dared to stand her ground against the family machine, a woman who bore the stain of scandal, poverty, and single motherhood. Charlotte had erased Grace from their records once. Now seeing her name resurface in the shadow of Ethan's return was an insult Charlotte could not overlook. She convened her legal team under the guise of family estate planning and carefully laid out her intentions to pursue custody of the children on the grounds of financial stability, educational opportunity, and moral environment. In her carefully worded argument, Grace was unfit, not abusive or negligent, but simply unworthy. She ran a shelter, lived paycheck to paycheck, and had no legal standing to keep the Whitman heirs in obscurity. Charlotte cloaked her motives in concern for the children's future, arguing they deserved prep schools, inheritance structure, not gardens and bunk beds and used books. What she didn't say was that she could not stomach the thought of reporters discovering the truth, that the Whitman dynasty included 4 biracial children born to a woman they once paid to disappear. If the story leaked, if the public ever saw the truth, the empire could crumble. So Charlotte moved swiftly, filing quiet petitions, initiating background checks, even offering donations to local officials. Her goal wasn't compassion, it was containment. She would take those children, rename them, reframe them, and write Grace out of their story once and for all. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, thin, crisp, and cold as the woman who sent it. Grace had just finished folding laundry at the shelter when Olivia handed her the envelope, her eyes narrow with unease. Inside was the first blow, a formal petition for custody filed by Charlotte Whitman, citing Grace's emotional instability, financial insufficiency, and failure to provide a structured, secure environment for 4 minors of Whitman descent. The words were clean, clinical, and weaponized. Grace's hands trembled as she read, the ache of disbelief settling deep in her chest. She had fought too long, too hard to raise her children with love, decency, and dignity, only to be painted as unfit by a woman who had never once looked them in the eye. But this wasn't just a petition, it was a full-scale assault. Charlotte had hired a private investigator to photograph the crumbling paint on the shelter's walls, the second-hand clothes in the children's closets, the late utility payments Grace had been too proud to beg help for. Every moment of hardship, every sacrifice was now twisted into evidence. The document claimed Grace was emotionally compromised due to years of prolonged poverty and professional regression, referencing her withdrawal from law school and unpaid shelter work as signs of cognitive decline. It even suggested she had indoctrinated the children to reject their paternal family, a cruel irony, given that she had spent every day shielding them from a truth that could destroy them. The most vicious detail came last: Charlotte's request for an emergency hearing and temporary removal of the children into Whitman, care for their own safety and potential. Grace felt the floor tilt beneath her. It wasn't just her children at stake, it was her very identity as their mother, her legacy of love, her entire life's worth. And as she stood frozen in the shelter kitchen, the pages still trembling in her grip, she realized the war for her children's future had begun with lies wrapped in legalese and a signature forged in ice. The courtroom felt colder than it should have in spring, sterile and humming with quiet judgment. As Grace sat alone at the respondent's table, her fingers clenched around the fraying edge of her thrift store skirt. Across from her sat Charlotte Whitman, flanked by 2 attorneys in polished navy suits and silk ties, their confidence suffocating. The judge's eyes skimmed the documents with a practiced neutrality, but Grace could feel the odds stacked against her with every passing second. No lawyer had agreed to represent her pro bono. Her savings barely covered groceries, let alone retainer fees. Her entire defense rested on the man sitting behind her in the pews. Mr. Dan, the quiet, steady worker who had helped fix the roof cook for the shelter, and unbeknownst to everyone in the room, fathered every child now at risk of being taken. He hadn't said it aloud. He hadn't claimed them. But he had stayed, and that had to mean something. Charlotte's lawyers painted Grace as a failed academic, an emotionally unstable single mother, running an underfunded shelter that doubled as a home for 4 minors deprived of traditional structure and security. The phrase echoed like a hammer in her skull. Grace tried to respond, her voice calm but shaking as she described her children's routines, their schooling, their joy, their resilience. She showed photos of birthdays, chore charts, handmade garden beds, proof that love had filled in where resources could not. But when the judge asked who could corroborate her claims, who could speak to her parenting in a legal capacity, her mouth went dry. Only one person stood. Mr. Dan stepped forward, his eyes meeting Grace's for the first time with something like apology and resolve stitched together. The courtroom quieted as he raised his hand, ready to testify. He wasn't a lawyer, nor family, nor blood recognized by court, but in that moment, he was everything she had, and everything to lose. The air in the courtroom turned electric the moment Ethan rose from the wooden bench, his movements slow but deliberate, every eye turning toward him, with a mixture of confusion and anticipation. Grace stared at him, her breath caught halfway in her chest, her heart pounding so loud she thought it might drown out whatever he was about to say. But his voice, when it came, was clear, calm, and filled with a quiet authority that no one in the room expected from a man in worn boots and a weathered flannel shirt. "Your Honor." He began stepping toward the front with a resolve that made even Charlotte's attorneys pause. "Before you proceed any further, I need to say something on record." The judge narrowed his eyes, gesturing for him to continue. "My name is Ethan Walker. I'm the biological father of Olivia, Caleb, Noah, and Sophie. A ripple spread through the courtroom like a stone thrown into still water. Charlotte's mouth fell open, frozen mid-breath, while Grace's hands flew to her lips, her eyes wide with shock, and something more fragile hope laced with disbelief. Ethan kept speaking, unwavering. I walked away from Grace years ago. I was a coward. My family didn't approve, and I let them dictate my life. I lost everything that mattered because of that decision, but I came back not to reclaim a title but to be present. I have no legal claim, but I know them, Your Honor. I know how Olivia overpacks her school bag with books she's already read, how Caleb hides his drawings behind the water heater because he doesn't think they're good enough, how Noah hums when he's nervous, and how Sophie names every flower she waters. I know them not because of biology, but because I stayed. And I am here to say under oath that I will not let my family rewrite this story. I reject their custody claim, their judgment, and their name. These children are mine not because I fathered them, but because I finally chose to be their father. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was reverent, stunned, and breaking. The kind of silence that changed everything. The courtroom froze in the wake of Ethan's revelation as if time itself had caught its breath. For a moment, no one moved. No shuffle of papers, no whispered objection, not even the tapping of a pen. It was as though every soul in the room had been suspended mid-air, trying to absorb the weight of what had just been said. The judge blinked slowly, his gavel hovering uncertainly above the bench. Charlotte Whitman, so composed, so meticulously armored in her designer suit and calculated words, sat motionless, her lips parted in shock. Her face, usually unreadable, now betrayed something far more fragile, disbelief laced with panic, as if the world she'd spent years constructing around power and perception had cracked wide open beneath her. Her fingers clutched the polished arms of her chair knuckles, white, unable to summon a single word to counter what had just been exposed. Grace, seated just feet away, covered her mouth as the first tear slipped down her cheek. It wasn't just from relief or vindication. It was grief, too. For all the years lost, for every bedtime story she'd read alone, every scraped knee she'd bandaged with no one by her side for the birthdays spent under shadows of judgment and whispers. She looked at Ethan not with anger, but with something far more complex, the silent ache of a woman who had once loved him deeply, the raw awe of witnessing someone finally become who they were always meant to be. The children seated behind her felt it too. Olivia's guarded eyes flickered with something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years, the dangerous, trembling hope that maybe the man she'd quietly hated had changed. The air felt different now, heavy but charged. What had been a courtroom battle suddenly became something else entirely, a reckoning, a surrender, a first step toward healing. The silence held them all together, fragile, suspended wholly. Olivia's chest burned with something she could no longer contain. As the courtroom slowly emptied, and the gravity of what had just happened hung in the air like dust in sunlight, she stormed out through the side door. Her fists clenched jaw tight, heart pounding like a war drum. She didn't want to cry, not now, not in front of him, not after everything. But when she heard his footsteps behind her, measured, hesitant, hopeful, her fury burst free before she could even face him. "Where were you?" She snapped, her voice sharp, cracking under the weight of 12 years of silence. "Where were you when Mom worked 3 jobs just to feed us? When Caleb cried himself to sleep thinking he didn't have a father? When I had to explain to Noah why his drawings went on the fridge and not to some man who cared? Where the hell were you when Sophie asked why we don't have a dad like the other kids?" She turned on him, eyes wild with betrayal, her voice rising with each word like a storm that had been waiting years to break. Ethan Mr. Dan no more stood, rooted guilt etched into the lines of his face like a confession. He opened his mouth, but she cut him off. Don't tell me you loved us. Don't tell me you watched from afar. That doesn't count. Love shows up. Love doesn't hide. You had 12 years. The words hung heavy between them, louder than any shout. Olivia was no longer a child yearning for answers. She was a girl grown too fast, forged in fire, standing in front of the man who had disappeared, and only now decided to reclaim his title. And deep down beneath the anger and pain, what hurt most was this: a part of her still wanted to believe him, still wanted him to say something that made the years make sense, but he couldn't, and she wouldn't let him off easy. Forgiveness did not arrive all at once. It came in fragments scattered across quiet evenings, hesitant glances, and moments too small for words. Each of the children reacted in their own way. Caleb, ever the protector, kept his distance but watched Ethan with calculating eyes, as if trying to decide whether to let him into a world he had learned to carry on his back. He didn't yell, didn't accuse, but there was a wall in his silence that dared Ethan to climb it slowly, respectfully, brick by brick. Sophie, the youngest, was the first to reach out, not with words, but with a tiny hand slipping into his one morning while watering the garden. She didn't ask where he had been, didn't demand answers. She simply stood beside him as if she had always known. But it was Noah who said the most without speaking at all. He didn't cry, didn't scream. For days after the courtroom, he carried his sketchpad like armor, observing Ethan from afar. Then one morning, Grace found a folded sheet of paper left on Ethan's cot in the shelter's back room. It was a drawing, simple but devastating. In Noah's quiet, precise lines, he had drawn the family: Grace in her apron holding Sophie's hand, Caleb with his tool belt, Olivia in a corner with arms crossed and fierce eyes. And in the middle, standing just behind them all, was Mr. Dan Ethan, not looming, not leading, just there. Not a word on the page. But Ethan sat with that picture in his lap for hours, tears falling onto the ink as he traced every line. It was the first time someone had drawn him into the family, not as a figure of the past, but of the present. Noah had forgiven him in the only language he trusted, pencil and stillness. And that silent mercy hit Ethan harder than any outburst ever could. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, quiet and warm, the kind of day that hung in the air like a held breath. Sophie had been unusually quiet all morning, her brow furrowed, not in anger but in thought. Grace had noticed her disappear into the back room where an old cedar box sat beneath their shared dresser, one that hadn't been touched in years. Inside that box, wrapped in soft cloth and buried beneath faded photographs and baby clothes, was the necklace. The same necklace Ethan had given Grace 12 years ago, when they still believed the world would let them be a family. It was a simple silver chain with a pendant that held 2 etched letters, EW. Sophie had never been told what it was or who it came from, but she had seen it once when she was younger, clutched in her mother's hand during one of those nights. Grace thought no one was watching. Sophie had remembered, and now, without a word, she walked into the courtyard where Ethan was kneeling by the raised garden beds, his hands caked with dirt, his eyes tired but softer than they used to be. She stood there for a long moment before reaching into the pocket of her dress and pulling out the necklace. Ethan looked up just as she stepped forward and placed it into his open palm. His fingers closed around it slowly, as if afraid it might vanish. Mama used to cry when she held it. Sophie whispered, her voice almost too soft to hear. I think it's yours. Ethan stared at the tiny pendant, the initials worn but still legible, and something in him cracked open. It wasn't just a necklace, it was the last piece of himself he had left behind, the one thread connecting him to a life he had once abandoned. And now, in the hands of the smallest child he had come to love without permission, it was returned to him not as a relic of shame, but as a symbol of quiet hope. The ballroom of the Whitman Grand Hotel shimmered under 1,000 crystal lights, each chandelier casting a soft golden glow that danced across polished marble and mirrored columns. The annual Whitman Foundation Gala was the pinnacle of elite Southern charity affairs, a place where legacy families displayed their benevolence like pearls draped across a silk gown. That night, Charlotte Whitman, clad in an elegant midnight blue dress tailored to command respect, stood proudly beneath a towering screen where the words Whitman Foundation for Children glowed in bold serif font. The media had been carefully curated, the guest list handpicked, and every camera was precisely positioned for her announcement, the unveiling of the Whitman Fund for Children, a philanthropic initiative crafted not only to elevate the family name, but also to neutralize the recent headlines swirling around her brother Ethan's mysterious reappearance. Charlotte smiled with a calculated warmth as she spoke to donors, politicians, and board members, each handshake rehearsed, each nod timed. She had waited years for this, her moment to cement the Whitman family legacy as a beacon of compassion and social responsibility. Tonight was not about the poor, it was about power. A live jazz band played a muted rendition of "What a Wonderful World" as waiters glided between tables carrying truffle canapes and flutes of aged champagne. Charlotte rehearsed her speech silently as she approached the stage, her stilettos echoing like punctuation marks on the polished floor. Cameras flashed. Applause rose in polite waves. But what no one knew, not the press, not the donors, not even her closest allies, was that this fund was more than a gesture. It was a weapon, a move on the chessboard, a calculated effort to position herself as the children's rightful guardian by proving the Whitmans could care for the vulnerable better than the woman who had raised them in silence. The gala to all the world was a celebration of generosity, but to Charlotte it was war dressed in velvet. Just as Charlotte stepped up to the podium ready to deliver the meticulously rehearsed speech that would solidify her place in the pantheon of Southern philanthropy, a voice interrupted the applause, steady and resonant, not from the stage, but from the side aisle. All heads turned as a man in a simple gray suit, no tie, stepped forward and quietly asked for the microphone. At first, murmurs rippled, some curious, others confused, but when Charlotte froze, her eyes locking onto the man with a mix of dread and disbelief, the entire room fell into a hush so complete even the clinking of champagne flutes stopped. Ethan Walker took the microphone with a calmness that belied the storm building behind his eyes. "Good evening," he began, his voice low but unwavering. "I'm sorry to interrupt this beautiful event, but there's something far more important than a speech tonight. There are children here, my children, who have never been acknowledged, never been celebrated, and certainly never been invited to claim their rightful name." The crowd exchanged stunned glances, whispering. Charlotte's fingers tightened on the edge of the podium. Ethan turned to the side and lifted a hand. "Olivia," he said softly. From a corner of the ballroom, a teenage girl stepped forward with shoulders square and eyes steady. She climbed the steps slowly, her presence alone cutting through the room's tension. Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder. "This is Olivia Walker, my firstborn daughter." A collective gasp filled the air. "Caleb," he called next. A boy emerged, a little oil-stained on his sleeves but proud chin raised. "Caleb Walker, my son." The introductions continued. Noah Walker, Sophie Walker, each child stepping onto the stage as if reclaiming something that had always been stolen from them. And with each name, Ethan's voice grew firmer, louder, and the facade Charlotte had built of legacy control denial began to crack like glass under pressure. "They don't need your fund," Ethan declared. "They need the truth, and tonight, they get it." As the applause slowly faded, and the tension in the gala ballroom hung like mist after a storm, Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, his hands trembling slightly, not with fear, but with something older, deeper, the weight of redemption, long delayed. One by one he turned to his children, not as a man seeking forgiveness, but as a father, finally choosing to be seen. In his hand, glinting under the soft chandelier light, were 4 identical boxes, small velvet and dark navy blue. "I don't expect you to forgive me tonight." He began, his voice raw and steady. "But I want each of you to have something I should have given you long ago. Not just my name, but a promise that I will never disappear again." He handed the first box to Olivia, who hesitated before opening it. Inside lay a silver necklace, simple yet elegant, with a delicate rectangular pendant engraved in fine script, "Olivia Walker." Her fingers brushed the name, and though she said nothing, her throat tightened. To Caleb, Ethan offered the second box. His palms were still calloused from the garage, his shirt slightly wrinkled, but when he opened the box and saw Caleb Walker etched in smooth steel, his eyes held a mix of defiance and silent longing. To Noah, who stood back with his usual quiet demeanor, Ethan knelt briefly, holding the necklace like a peace offering. Noah didn't speak, only nodded once, accepting the box as if it were a fragile truth. Lastly, Sophie approached, her gaze unwavering, and Ethan held her necklace out with both hands. "I should have been there when you took your first steps," he whispered. "But I'm here now." Each child now wore a necklace that bore their true name, Walker, not a symbol of possession, but of belonging, not of wealth, but of presence. And for the first time, beneath the sparkling lights of the Whitman Gala, the family once hidden in shame stood visible, unashamed, and whole. The boardroom, usually a space of sterile order and measured voices, pulsed with something different that morning: unease. The mahogany table gleamed under the weight of tension as board members of Whitman Enterprises filed in one by one, carrying sleek dossiers and guarded expressions. At the head of the table sat Charlotte Whitman, impeccable as always in her tailored black suit. But this time her composure felt brittle, as though every calm breath she took was forced against a crumbling wall of control. It started subtly with one question about budgetary overreach on the proposed Whitman Foundation for Children, then another about unilateral decisions made without full board approval. But the undercurrent of their inquiry quickly revealed itself. Charlotte was no longer the unquestioned heir to the empire. Her iron grip, once mistaken for strength, now looked disturbingly like manipulation. "You attempted to claim custody of the children without legal precedent," one director said, flipping a page in his report. "You misrepresented their mother's capabilities to a court." Another added, "You concealed Ethan's whereabouts from the board for over a year. A direct heir. That's not just family, he's a voting stakeholder." A third leaned in voice sharper. "Were you planning to erase him altogether, Charlotte?" The room didn't need raised voices. The truth itself carried weight. Her attempt to control the narrative, to cast Grace as unstable, to parade a foundation built on false moral high ground, had backfired. The televised moment from the gala where Ethan declared his children publicly was now viral, and with it came questions about legacy, about who held the moral center of Whitman Enterprises, and whether the company had become a reflection of Charlotte's will rather than its founding values. As she tried to answer, her words stumbled not from lack of eloquence, but from the realization that power built on secrecy and control could not survive the light. The board did not shout. They simply voted. And in the quiet that followed, Charlotte Whitman felt something she had not felt in decades: the unmistakable sting of consequence. She stood alone in the penthouse office, the city below her glittering like a kingdom she could no longer command. Charlotte didn't turn when she heard the door open, but she knew it was Ethan. He didn't knock. He never needed to. For a long moment they said nothing. The silence between them had been a lifetime in the making, 15 years of unspoken blame, ambition, and the cold arithmetic of legacy. "I suppose you've come to gloat," she said finally, her voice tired but still sharp, brittle like porcelain about to crack. Ethan stepped into the room, quiet but steady, the same way he had walked back into his children's lives. "No," he said, looking at her not with hatred, but with the kind of sorrow only a brother could carry. "I came to say goodbye." She turned to face him, then arms crossed, chin lifted in defiance, but her eyes betrayed something deeper, a flicker of confusion, of vulnerability. "You've won," she snapped. "You humiliated me in front of the board, in front of the world. You've got your perfect little family now. What more do you want?" Ethan shook his head slowly. "This was never about winning." "That's where you and I differ." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an envelope, an official resignation from any claim to Whitman Enterprises, signed and dated. He laid it gently on the desk between them, like a final offering. "You can keep the company, Charlotte," he said, voice low, but resolute eyes meeting hers with a painful clarity. "Build towers, make headlines, rewrite the next 30 years if you need to. But I'm done chasing things that look like love but feel like control." She stared at the paper hands, unmoving. Ethan turned to leave, but paused at the door. "You once told me family was the price we pay for legacy. You were wrong. Legacy means nothing without the people who remember who you are." His voice softened into something close to forgiveness. "I choose them. I choose the kids. I choose Grace. That's my empire now." And with that, he walked away, leaving Charlotte alone with her empire of glass and the echo of the brother she had tried to erase. The door clicked shut behind him, but the silence it left was deafening. Charlotte remained still, standing in the center of the room that once symbolized power, command, control. The envelope lay untouched on the polished desk, a small rectangle that held a finality she wasn't ready to face. Her hands trembled slightly, but she clasped them together tightly, unwilling to give in to what she wasn't sure. It wasn't the boardroom she mourned, nor the title of CEO, nor the carefully curated narrative of the Whitman legacy. What pierced through her like a blade was the final look in Ethan's eyes, not anger, not triumph, but a quiet, irrevocable goodbye. She had always thought she was doing the right thing, protecting the family name, shielding the company, preserving the legacy their parents had left behind. She'd believed that love was something that could be managed, corrected, shaped into something presentable. But what Ethan had done today, walking onto that stage with 4 children who carried his name, his pain and his redemption, had dismantled her beliefs entirely. For the first time, Charlotte understood that she hadn't just lost control. She had lost Ethan. Not the Ethan who once stood beside her in press photos or boardroom meetings, but the boy who used to crawl into her bed during thunderstorms, who once whispered his dreams of building something good, something human. The boy who believed in love before he was taught to be ashamed of it. Her lips parted, slightly trembling, but no words came out, only the sound of her own breath catching in her throat as the tears finally slipped down her face. Not dramatic, not performative, just quiet, raw, real. She sank into the chair behind the desk, staring at the city skyline that once felt like her kingdom, and for the first time it looked foreign, cold, irrelevant. The empire was intact, but the one person who had ever truly seen her was gone. Not because he hated her, but because he had chosen to live without her. And that was the wound that would never heal, not the loss of power, but the irreversible truth that she would never again be the sister he needed her to be. The evening light filtered softly through the worn windows of the old shelter, casting a golden glow across the mismatched table where the family had gathered. No cameras, no gala lights, no declarations or speeches, just the clatter of forks against chipped plates, the aroma of warm rice and vegetables wafting from the center, and the low murmur of voices overlapping in quiet joy. Olivia's sleeves rolled up, an apron slightly stained moved around the kitchen with the calm command of someone who had done this before, though this time her movements were lighter, less out of necessity, more out of love. Caleb, seated next to Ethan, was in the middle of an exaggerated retelling of the time he tried to fix the shelter's broken toaster using 2 spoons and a hairdryer, his arms flailing for effect as laughter rippled around the table. Noah sat quietly, focused on his plate occasionally, glancing up and offering small, almost shy smiles that said more than any words. And Sophie, perched between Ethan and Olivia, her legs swinging under the chair, took a thoughtful bite of rice chewed, then leaned in with wide eyes and whispered, "We should call this Dad's home rice." No, wait. Rice with Dad. Actually, I like home rice with Dad, but shorter. Let's call it Dad's home rice. The table burst into laughter again, not at the name, but at the sound of it. Something ordinary, affectionate, and profoundly symbolic. Ethan looked around the table, his hand instinctively resting on Sophie's back, and for a long moment he didn't say anything. He didn't need to. This was the dinner he had never dared to imagine, 4 children eating together without fear, without shame, without needing to explain why the man sitting at the head of the table had once been a stranger. Olivia reached over and refilled her father's plate without a word. Caleb slid his cup toward Noah, who had finished his juice. And in that small act of passing the cup, of sharing food, of naming a dish that could only exist in this moment, they weren't just healing. They were living. A family at last. The water ran warm over Ethan's hands as he stood at the small sink sleeves rolled to his elbows, carefully scrubbing a chipped plate that had once held Dad's home rice. The sink was old, the faucet creaked slightly, and the sponge had seen better days. But in this moment, none of it mattered. The shelter's kitchen was quiet, now the kind of quiet that hums with contentment, like a song after the final note. He moved slowly, deliberately, not because the task was hard, but because he didn't want the moment to end. Each plate he washed carried a trace of something sacred, of laughter, of forgiveness, of ordinary grace. Behind him, Caleb and Noah were sweeping. Olivia was stacking leftovers, and Sophie was carefully drying the forks one by one, humming under her breath. Then it happened. A soft voice, almost casual, but cutting through the silence with the clarity of a bell. "Hey, Dad, you missed a spot." Ethan paused mid-scrub the plate, still half soapy in his hands, his breath catching in his chest before he dared to turn around. It was Sophie. She grinned up at him, holding out a damp dish towel, eyes shining with mischief and something far deeper, acceptance. For a heartbeat, he didn't know what to say. The word echoed in his head. Dad, so simple, so small, and yet impossibly vast. He had read it on forums, heard it shouted in playgrounds by other children, once even muttered in dreams he hadn't dared to believe. But now, it was real. His. Earned, not given. Slowly a smile spread across his face, not the forced, polished smile he used to wear in boardrooms, but the kind that rose from somewhere buried and tender. He took the towel, drying his hands before gently tousling Sophie's hair. "Thanks, kiddo," he murmured, his voice low and steady. Inside, however, everything swelled. That one word, spoken without hesitation, had cracked something open. Not guilt, not pain, but joy, the quiet, anchoring kind that doesn't demand attention, but settles in like light through clean glass. For the first time in years, Ethan Whitman stood still in his own name, not as a CEO, not as a runaway, but simply as a father. Grace sat at the small desk in the corner of the shelter room, an old lamp casting a golden pool of light over the wrinkled sheet of paper in front of her. The children were asleep, their breathing steady behind the closed door, and the building itself seemed to sigh in time with her pen as she finally allowed herself to write, not to anyone else, but to the girl she used to be. Her fingers trembled slightly as she began, unsure at first how to begin. "Dear me," she wrote, then paused. There was something fragile about addressing yourself after years of being silent, of being overlooked, forgotten, and pushed aside. Her handwriting was uneven, shaped by exhaustion, but anchored by purpose. You once believed you were invisible. You were told so many times that your voice was too soft, your past too shameful, your worth too thin to carry a name. You were erased from family records, from photo albums, from the stories they told at dinner tables where you were never invited. You were made to believe that silence was your safest form. And for a long time you accepted it. You survived in the shadows, folding yourself smaller and smaller until even you forgot the sound of your own laughter. Her pen moved more firmly now, tears glistening in the corner of her eyes, but not falling. But today something shifted. Today your children called you mom in a courtroom that tried to take them. Today the man who once left came back, not to fix you, but to stand beside you. Today you heard your daughter name a meal after you. Today your son laughed because you were home. Today you looked in the mirror and saw someone who fought quietly and lived loudly, not in volume, but in truth. She paused, then wrote the final line, slowly pressing each word into the paper as if it could not be erased. You were once deleted from history, but today you exist, fully, fiercely, undeniably. She signed it without a name because she no longer needed one to prove she mattered. The paper would stay folded beneath her pillow, not as proof to anyone else, but as a quiet testimony to herself. Grace was here. Grace is here. Grace remains. The sign on the modest but radiant brick building read, "The Ellis Foundation," a name chosen not for prestige, but for memory, for legacy, for the quiet strength of a woman long gone, but never forgotten. Ellis had been Grace's middle name, and coincidentally the name of Ethan's late mother, a woman he barely remembered, but whose kindness had once cradled him in a broken childhood. It felt right, no necessary, that this new chapter be born under her name, a name that held no corporate title, no mansion, no boardroom, but rather the ache and resilience of a family that had been shattered and slowly made whole again. The idea had come not from a press strategy or philanthropic consultant, but from Olivia, who one evening simply asked, "What if other kids like us never get their courtroom miracle?" It struck something deep in Ethan and Grace, this realization that their story, while hard-won, was rare. Too many mothers were still fighting alone. Too many children were still afraid of bedtime. Too many fathers hadn't yet realized they could come back. The Ellis Foundation became their answer, not to erase what had happened, but to redeem it brick by brick, grant by grant, life by life. They designed it to be accessible, not intimidating, warm, not clinical. There would be legal aid for single mothers fending off unjust custody threats, emergency housing for abandoned children, therapy programs for fathers trying to rebuild trust, scholarships for kids who had lived in silence too long, and yes, a kitchen. Because they had learned healing often began over shared meals, laughter-burnt rice, and stories told with trembling voices. As Ethan looked out the window that first morning of the foundation's opening, he didn't see donors or reporters. He saw a teenage mother nervously holding her baby. He saw a young boy tracing his name in chalk on the sidewalk. He saw a man maybe once like himself standing at the threshold, unsure if redemption was still an option. Ethan stepped toward the door. "It is," he whispered. "It always is. There are things that cannot be undone. Years, lost words, unsaid mistakes carved into the bones of memory like names on stone." Ethan knew that. So did Grace. And each of the children in their own quiet ways carried the scars of what had been taken from them, time present's truth. But there came a day when looking back no longer served survival, when grief stopped being a destination and became instead a backdrop for something else, possibility. That day didn't arrive in a courtroom or under the glittering lights of a gala. It came slowly in the gentle hush after dinner, in the quiet act of folding laundry together, in the scribbled drawings pinned to the fridge that now had 5 names instead of 4. It was in the moment Sophie whispered Dad, not out of obligation but choice, in the soft hum of Caleb's laughter, as he taught Ethan to play a game they had once played alone, in the sparkle of Olivia's eyes when she let him braid her hair badly, but with effort. It was in Noah's silent gesture of taking Ethan's hand one morning without looking up. They did not forget what had happened. They did not pretend the past had never hurt them. But they chose deliberately, bravely, to no longer let it define the rest of their story. And that, Ethan realized, was the truth he had been running from his entire life. You cannot go back and make a new beginning, but you can start where you are and change the ending. The Ellis Foundation wasn't about erasing pain. It was about proving that healing was possible, not because time erases wounds, but because love, when chosen again and again, becomes the thread that mends even the most tattered pages. And as the sun spilled through the windows of their modest new home, Grace's words echoed softly in Ethan's mind. Words she had once written to herself, but now belonged to them all. We were once written out of history, but today we write ourselves back in. The sky was already folding into shades of evening when Ethan stepped outside the shelter, the familiar creak of the old screen door brushing against his shoulder as it closed behind him. He didn't wear a suit anymore, just a soft flannel shirt rolled at the sleeves, hands that no longer signed billion-dollar contracts, but knew how to tie a child's shoes, repair a broken bunk, and stir soup for 20. The building behind him still smelled of coffee and distant sorrow, but now also held laughter, echoing in the dining room chalk drawings scrawled across the side wall, and beds named after mothers who once had none. He looked out into the dusk, letting the air fill his lungs with the quiet satisfaction of work that had nothing to do with profit and everything to do with presence. That's when he heard it. The hesitant shuffle of sneakers, the rustle of plastic bags being clutched tighter, the guarded voice of someone who had learned not to expect kindness. A girl no older than 17 stood beneath the flickering light of the porch, her face half shadowed by the oversized hoodie she wore. Hair-messy eyes, alert but tired. She looked at him like people look when they're deciding whether or not to hope. "Are you the manager?" she asked, voice barely louder than the wind. Ethan paused, met her gaze not with pity, but with recognition. "The kind that says I've been where you are." A small smile curled on his lips, not because he had the answer she was expecting, but because he finally understood his place in the world. "No," he said gently, shaking his head. "I'm just someone who once got to stay." She blinked as if unsure what to do with that kind of honesty, and then nodded slowly. Behind him, the door creaked open once more, letting the warm scent of dinner and the murmur of voices spill into the cold. Ethan stepped aside, holding it open. No grand speeches, no promises, just the quiet invitation of someone who had been lost and then found. In life, we don't always get the chance to rewrite the beginning, but we do get to choose how the story ends. Ethan's journey was never about being perfect. It was about showing up flawed, late, uncertain, but showing up anyway. And sometimes that's the bravest thing you can do. Whether you've made mistakes, been abandoned, or simply feel forgotten, remember this healing doesn't begin with grand gestures. It begins with presence. With choosing to stay to listen, to make one small decision today that's better than the one yesterday. Families are not always built by blood, but by those who choose to love again and again, even after all the damage. We often look at people and forget the chapters they never got to write. We forget that behind every tired face might be a silent battle, a stolen childhood, or a second chance waiting to be offered. And maybe you're not Ethan. Maybe you're Grace fighting to be heard, or Sophie offering silent forgiveness through a chain, or that homeless girl at the door asking for a space to breathe. Whoever you are not beyond redemption. You are not too late to begin again. Maybe you don't have a shelter to run, but maybe you have time to listen to a story, give someone your full presence, or even forgive yourself for a mistake long past. That's how healing begins. That's how new endings are written. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of someone you love, leave a comment below. Tell us your story, big or small. Save this video so you can return to it on the days you forget how far you've come. And if you want to follow more stories like this, stories about second chances, healing, and the quiet power of love, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Someone out there might need this story. Maybe that someone is you.